The Fantastic Four. Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm are nicknamed Marvel's First Family. That name captures the prominence of the team within the Marvel Universe, where they are celebrity superhumans and scientific patrons to governments and other superheroes alike. But it also captures their importance to comic book history. After all, Fantastic Four was the first superhero comic to begin developing long-term stories for its heroes and villains across multiple issues. This continuity would expand through other books and eventually become the entire Marvel Universe, making the Four the literal first family of Marvel. But more than that, it was the first time that a superhero comic was written with an adult audience in mind. It was the shocking success of Fantastic Four #1 among college students, which prompted the publishers to revitalize the superhero genre after 20 years in the doldrums. It's not an exaggeration to say that without the publication of Fantastic Four #1, superheroes would not occupy their current place of importance in our cultural zeitgeist. Now, the Fantastic Four may have been Marvel's first family, but they were not its first superheroes. In fact, their debut came several decades after the advent of the genre, a period of popularity that came to be called the Golden Age of comic books. Sparked by the creation of Superman in 1938, his unbelievable success kicked off a decade of rapid-fire imagination and imitation. The debuts of now legendary figures such as Batman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash were scattered between more forgettable, lesser superheroes who flooded the newsstands where comics were sold. But the Golden Age publishers didn't see Superman and his ilk any differently from the myriad other micro-genres which they rotated through their pages. Their business model was simply cheap, disposable entertainment, high-concept ideas, and shocking, outlandish imagery. There was no sign of the detailed and complex plots that we associate with comic books today. Instead, most Golden Age comics simply aimed to evoke wonder at the idea of a superhero, using them as mere curiosities instead of characters. And after World War II, the culture eventually shifted and superheroes faded from popularity, much to the dismay of one Stanley Lieber, a writer and editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics. Now, Lieber had worked in superhero comics for his entire adult life. He started at Marvel as a 17-year-old, creating stories for the company's best-selling Golden Age heroes, the Submariner, the Human Torch, and, of course, the wartime smash hit, Captain America, created by Joe Simon and artist Jack Kirby. Now, as the superhero genre slowly declined over his time at Marvel, Lieber had diversified his work, writing anything that his boss thought the markets wanted. But he wasn't happy about it. As he would later recall, "Whatever was selling at the moment, Goodman would publish books in that genre. For instance, when it looked as though westerns were hot, we added a lot of western titles. When romance stories are doing well, we published a lot of romance books. Then we did a lot of war magazines, then horror, then crime. We were never leaders in the field. We always just followed the trends." Now, disillusioned by this, Lieber considered leaving the comics industry entirely and started taking on freelance writing jobs for radio, advertising, and other areas. This prompted an intervention from his wife, Joan, who Lieber would regard as his lifelong muse in comics. "Joan wanted me to bear down and make something of myself in the comic book field," Lieber would later explain in interviews. "She wondered why I did not put as much effort and creativity into the comics as I seemed to be putting into my other freelance endeavors. And the fact is, I had always thought of my comic book work as a temporary job, even after all those years. It was her little dissertation that made me suddenly realize it was time to start concentrating on what I was doing, to carve a real career for myself in the nowhere world of comic books." Now, to cement this new outlook on his comics career, Lieber legally changed his name to the pen name he used at Marvel, Stan Lee. Rejecting the ironic distance that he had previously kept from the industry he worked in, from that point on, Lee would become synonymous with it. Now, fortune was on Stan's side. He would soon get another unexpected chance to write about his beloved superheroes. Around this time, his boss, Martin Goodman, went out golfing with the head of a DC Comics subsidiary. This talkative executive, boasted to Goodman that DC, who had always been Marvel's main rival in comics, were seeing significant sales with the superhero team-up comic Justice League of America. Ever the trend chaser, Goodman rushed back to his editor-in-chief and ordered Lee to put together a new title, featuring a team of fresh superheroes. Stan was excited, but he knew he'd need to find an artistic collaborator for this new super team, so he began discussing some of his ideas with Jack Kirby, whose distinctive pencil had illustrated a teenaged Lee's very first public story, some 20 years prior. Kirby was already a famous creator, responsible for Captain America and other hits, and he'd worked at pretty much every major publisher's bullpen across the whole industry. Kirby agreed to help on Lee's new book, and together they sat down to craft a super team which were unlike any superheroes before them, and who would allow Kirby and Lee to build stories of a kind never before seen in comics. These characters were recognizably human, with flaws and complex relationships with each other, despite their amazing powers and heroic mission. Their origin story relied on science, incorporating ideas which were looming large in the public mind in 1961. Get this, a team of astronauts in the space race are bombarded by cell-warping radiation and become fantastic. Both men were prepared to risk their careers in comics if it meant making something that they could be proud of. As Lee said, "For just this once, I would do the type of story I myself would enjoy reading, and the characters would be the kind of characters that I could personally relate to. They'd be flesh and blood, they'd have their faults and foibles, they'd be fallible and feisty, and most important of all, inside their colourful costume booties, they'd still have feet of clay." Meanwhile, it was up to Jack the King Kirby to craft the visual identity of the four. He can be thanked for the Thing's orange brick-like skin, as well as the group's distinctive costumes, these skin-tight, minimalist masterpieces, which they still wear close variations of in the comics to this day. But Kirby didn't even introduce those iconic bodysuits until issue number 3 of the comic. In their critical introduction story, and even on the cover of Fantastic Four number 1, he drew the superheroes wearing their civilian clothes, fighting against evil. It was simple Kirby genius which helped realize Stan Lee's vision of relatable superhumans, or as he would later coin the phrase, heroes with hang-ups. Now, the success of Fantastic Four number 1 was immediate, obvious, and much celebrated. While Kirby's amazing artwork has to get some credit, it was Stan Lee's decision to deconstruct the Golden Age flawless superhero archetype and write nuanced, sympathetic super people, which seemed to be the difference maker. It's noteworthy that Mr. Fantastic's abilities and visual design were pretty much copied from another character, Plastic Man, and Johnny Storm's appearance and powers as the Human Torch virtually identical to the Golden Age version of the same character that Lee used to write. And yet, the Fantastic Four versions stand far taller in comics history, thanks simply to their superior personalities and storylines which stood out even in this very first issue. Shares of Fantastic Four number 1 are available at mythicmarkets.com.